On December 1st, 1934, a single gunshot in Leningrad would change the history of the Soviet Union forever. Inside the corridors of the Smolny Institute, Sergei Kirov, one of the most popular Bolshevik leaders and an influential ally of Stalin, was assassinated. At first, it seemed like the death of just one man. But this event became the moment when the Soviet repressive machine entered a completely new stage. A country that promised to build a new future began sinking into a world of fear, suspicion, and the search for invisible enemies. Night arrests, raids, secret sentences, NKVD Troikas, and the Gulag system became symbols of the era later known as the Great Terror. Millions of people lived with one terrifying thought. The next knock on the door could be for them. But even the most terrifying machine needs someone to make it work. In 1937, Stalin fully opened the doors to the hell of the Great Terror, and Nikolai Yezhov became the man who set this machine in motion. At first glance, he did not look like someone who would become one of the main executors of the coming repressions. A short party official who once loved literature and wrote poetry. But his name would become the symbol of the most intense period of Stalin's repressions, Yezhovshchina. How did a system created to destroy the enemies of the state begin destroying the very people who built it? This is the story of the Great Terror. Political repression in the Soviet Union existed almost from the moment the Bolsheviks came to power. Violence, control, and the fight against real or imagined enemies became part of the political system. But the second half of the 1930s became the moment when this mechanism reached an unprecedented scale. After Kirov's death, Stalin's suspicion and his struggle against real and imagined enemies only intensified. Threats were now being searched for among old revolutionaries, party officials, military commanders, and even people who had served the system for decades. Many different theories and rumors appeared around Kirov's assassination. Some contemporaries even suggested that Stalin himself could have been involved. Rumors and political jokes about possible involvement of the authorities spread among the people. However, historians have never found direct evidence supporting this theory. One thing is clear: Stalin used Kirov's death to further strengthen his control over the country. On that very day, Stalin signed what would become his death charter for millions. Cases involving terrorist activity could now be processed extremely quickly, while the possibilities for defense and appeal were severely limited. Death sentences were carried out almost immediately after being announced. The state was creating a system where a person's fate could be decided in just a matter of days. One of Stalin's greatest political fears remained Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was one of the most influential Bolsheviks after the revolution and Stalin's main rival in the struggle for power. But he underestimated how deeply Stalin had already secured his position inside the party apparatus. When Lenin became ill and later died, changing the balance of power became almost impossible. In 1929, Trotsky was expelled from the Soviet Union, and in 1932, he was stripped of his Soviet citizenship. But even far beyond the borders of the country, his name remained a symbol of conspiracy and a possible threat to Stalin's power. In 1937, Stalin finally opened the doors to the hell of the Great Terror. And the main instrument of this system became Nikolai Yezhov. Under his leadership, the repressive machine began working at maximum speed. Documents, lists, arrests and sentences became the daily work of a system that was no longer slowing down. The first blow came against the old enemies of the Bolsheviks, former White Army members and other opponents of Soviet power. Many people were sentenced on fabricated charges. Some were executed, while others were sent to labor camps. But very quickly, the machine began searching for new enemies. Writers, cultural figures, military officers, party members, and ordinary citizens could all fall under suspicion. Fear became part of everyday life in the Soviet Union. And the darkest chapter was still ahead. Before we continue the story of the Great Terror, support Ghost Archive by subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It helps us create more historical documentaries about events that should never be forgotten. Now, let us return to the moment when fear stopped being only a tool of power and became part of everyday life for millions of people. The next wave of the repressive machine spread across the republics of the Soviet Union. Ukraine, Belarus, Russia and other regions received orders to search for internal enemies. The state created an atmosphere where suspicion became a normal part of life. People were convinced that an enemy could be anywhere, among neighbors, colleagues and even close friends. Former officials, cultural figures, writers, military officers, specialists and people from different social groups began appearing on the lists. And the system worked. Thousands of reports, accusations and denunciations were sent to the NKVD. A single word could change a person's life forever. But the most terrifying part of this system was that it did not guarantee safety even to those who helped it. Those who wrote other people's names on the list today could find their own name there tomorrow. Moscow demanded that regional NKVD departments find more and more so-called enemies of the people. To speed up the process, special NKVD Troikas were created. An NKVD officer, a prosecutor and a party representative could decide a person's fate without a full trial or a real possibility of defense. In July 1937, the leaders of regional NKVD departments were summoned to Moscow. The meeting became preparation for one of the largest waves of repression in Soviet history. Nikolai Yezhov gave the signal to begin a massive purge of the population. For the system, the priority was no longer evidence. It was fulfilling the objectives that had been set. For his loyalty to the regime, Yezhov received one of the highest state awards, the Order of Lenin. Yezhov knew the purges would claim innocent lives. To him, that wasn't a flaw. It was inevitable. On July 30th, 1937, NKVD Order number 00447 was issued. Officially, it targeted former kulaks, criminal elements and anti-Soviet groups. In reality, it became one of the main mechanisms of the Great Terror. Under Yezhov, the order was simple. If they could stand, they could be shot. Each region was given special limits. The first category meant execution, while the second meant imprisonment in labor camps. In the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, the initial first category limit in 1937 was about 26,000 people. Later, these numbers increased, and the total approved for execution under the first category rose to more than 80,000 people. But the most disturbing part was how the system itself operated. Some regional leaders personally asked Moscow to increase these limits. They tried to prove their loyalty and exceed the expectations of the system. Human lives had become numbers in official reports. But the Great Terror was not aimed only at ordinary people. The moment came when Stalin turned the repressive machine against the old Bolshevik elite itself. People who had built the revolution alongside him were now declared enemies of that revolution. The symbol of this campaign became the three major Moscow trials. In August 1936, the first trial targeted the so-called Trotskyist Zinovьevist terrorist center. They were accused of organizing conspiracies, the assassination of Sergei Kirov, and plans to remove the Soviet leadership. All 16 defendants were sentenced to death and executed. In January 1937, the second trial targeted the so-called parallel anti-Soviet Trotskyist center. Out of 17 defendants, 13 received death sentences and were executed. But the final strike against the old party elite was still ahead. In March 1938, the last major trial began, the case of the so-called Right Trotskyist bloc. On trial were people who had once stood at the very center of Soviet power. Out of 21 defendants, 18 were sentenced to death. On March 15, 1938, they were executed at the Kommunarka shooting ground. Between 1937 and 1938, the Great Terror reached its peak. 1.5 million people were arrested and 700,000 were executed. But the ending of the Great Terror became deeply symbolic. The machine created to search for enemies began to devour its own creators. More than 14,000 NKVD officers were executed. In the end, the Great Terror consumed not only its victims, but many of its executioners as well. Among them was Nikolai Yezhov himself. The man whose name became the symbol of the most intense wave of repression was now declared an enemy of the people. In 1940, Nikolai Yezhov was executed by the same system he had served. His name was removed from documents, photographs, and official history. The man who approved lists of enemies eventually found himself on one. The Great Terror ended, but the fear it created lived on for generations. The history of the Great Terror shows that a system built on fear eventually begins to fear even its own shadow. If you are interested in the forgotten chapters of history, subscribe to Ghost Archive and support this video with a like. Here we uncover the past that must never be forgotten.